Welcome to Contact's mini webinar series, where we focus on a series of topics important to industry that are recently coming up in conversation. Today's topic is going to be on acceptable levels of risk and their relation to fresh produce safety. My name is Dr. Channah Rock. I'm a water quality specialist and professor at the University of Arizona. I focus largely on agriculture water treatment, as well as pathogen survival and persistence in the environment. This project is brought to you on behalf of Contact, which is a Specialty Crops Research Initiative grant funded by the USDA. Thanks for joining us today. To kick us off, one of the important things to think about when discussing acceptable risk is the definition of a hazard versus a risk. Oftentimes we hear folks interchange these two terms, and so to set the baseline and get everybody on the same page, I've put a few definitions up for you here today. Hazard is a biological, chemical, or physical agent in or condition of food with the potential to cause an adverse health effect. In a couple of slides, I'll walk you through a couple of examples of different hazards versus risks. The difference between a hazard and a risk is the function or the probability of that adverse health effect happening. Really, it's the likelihood of the occurrence of that hazard causing, and that is what equates to risk. I think it's also important to think about there's no such thing as zero risk, and we'll discuss that here today. Let's think about this example. Here I have a hammer, which I've identified as the hazard. We have a toolbox in the center, which is controlling or managing or could influence the potential for that hazard to cause a risk. But the risk in itself is the actual use of that hammer, the act of hammering. So if this gentleman in this picture accidentally makes a mistake and hits his fingers with that hammer, that's a risky activity and associated with that hazard of the hammer. Alternatively, here's one that brings it closer to home for us that work in the fresh produce safety world. We have on the left-hand side E. coli bacteria, which we've identified as the hazard. Let's just say for this example that E. coli bacteria potentially could be in a pre-harvest agriculture water source. The method of irrigation that we're using for fresh produce is controlling or managing or influencing the potential of that hazard to make it onto that produce. But the actual risk itself is not necessarily the bacteria and not necessarily the method of irrigation, but it's the act of eating that salad. That is the risk. That's the risk that is exposing a person to that E. coli bacteria, which is the hazard. Oftentimes we're asked, what is an acceptable risk or what is a tolerable risk? We're going to use EPA as the framework, specifically looking at drinking water. The EPA considers one infection per 10,000 individuals per year. So one case of gastrointestinal illness as a reasonable guideline for potable drinking water that comes out of your tap at home. This number was derived in 1987 by determining the waterborne disease burden Americans already tolerated. What were they already accepting of? At that time, the total number of reported cases of waterborne illness per year was estimated to be about 25,000. What EPA did is they took that 25,000, they divided it by the U.S. population at that time, which was 250 million, and came up with the acceptable or the tolerable risk of 1 in 10,000. It's important to think about these numerical standards or these limits or thresholds are important for guiding and improving food safety. For these standards to be meaningful and also enforceable by regulatory agencies, they must have a certain level of confidence. We'll discuss that now. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about testing, and more specifically, pre-harvest testing of fresh produce. We often hear folks say you can't test your way to food safety, but what does that actually mean? We know that measurement of pathogens or indicators in water or in produce can help industry understand the potential risk that might be there. But it's also important to consider practical considerations such as cost and the methodology that's used, how specific it is, who's going to do this, how easy this is, and then how quickly or how slowly you potentially could get results back. In order for us to have useful testing, we really need to understand the relationship, so the number of pathogens that somebody potentially could ingest and the resulting risk of infection. Some additional food for thought is that despite the fact that many risk assessments have been done for various different pathogens, so E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, and many different produce types, to date, none have been used to establish a regulatory limit or a threshold or a numerical value for that pathogen in produce. 0 is still the goal. So, is zero risk really zero? I think we constantly ask ourselves that in the world of academia, trying to work with the fresh produce industry as well as the regulatory community on developing sampling plans and understanding how pathogens move in and around the environment in which these are grown. I would challenge you all to really think about your production system and the way that you manage that and trying to identify, are there risks present, what those hazards might be, and how we can continue to drive to this 0 threshold. Some additional questions to consider specifically for industry. Should we still test? Thinking about water or raw product or finished product itself. The answer is yes, but industry really needs to understand testing limitations and what results do mean and what they do not mean. Oftentimes, getting a bunch of zeros for testing can create a false sense of security, and we don't want to create that. Testing can be beneficial to identify gross contamination events or track trends over time. So we still like to push the idea of testing, but really trying to understand what it can mean and how it can be useful. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to learn more about the Contact Project, I've put the website there listed above. We also have a variety of additional resources that can be found on our social media applications, whether it be Twitter or Instagram or YouTube. Just look for Produce Safety Science. Thanks so much and make contact.